The service elevator at the Vance Foundation Gala rattled like it hadn't been greased since the building went up in '08. Marcus leaned against the dented wall, trying to keep his weight off his left knee. The joint had been acting up since the humidity spiked 3 days ago. He could still hear the muffled string quartet upstairs, playing some watered-down version of a pop song that made his teeth hurt. The HVAC panel on the 4th floor was throwing a code he'd seen 100 times. Dirty filters, clogged condensate line, stand-up RD neglect, but the work order said Priority 1, CEO event. That usually meant some rich guy's wife was sweating through her silk and someone needed to pay. He shifted the toolbox to his other hand. The metal handle dug into his palm, right where the callus from RS of rifle grips used to be. That spot didn't hurt anymore. Nothing much did. The elevator doors groaned open onto the main ballroom floor. He didn't step out right away. He waited, scanning. Old habit. The corridor was lined with tempura repartitions, thick velvet curtains hiding the catering stations and utility closets from the guests. He could hear ice clinking in crystal glasses, the low hum of forced conversation, and the distinct click of high heels on marble. He smelled perfume, expensive, floral, the kind that tried too hard to cover up the metallic tang of FOR. Marcus stepped out, heading for the service hallway that ran behind the kitchen. He kept his head down. That was rule 1 in these places. Don't make eye contact with the help, and definitely don't look at the owners. He was just a shadow in a navy blue jumpsuit with Apex Climate Control stitched in yellow over the breast pocket. His hair was cut short, high and tight, though it had grown out a bit on top. He hadn't bothered to shave that morning. The stubble was grayer than the hair on his head. He passed the swinging doors of the kitchen. Heat blasted out, smelling of garlic, butter, and bleach. A line so okay with a stained apron glanced at him, then looked away. No one wanted to talk to the AC guy. He was a necessary inconvenience. He turned the corner into the quieter west wing. The noise of the Pa Rudy dulled here, replaced by the rhythmic thumping of the air handlers. He found the access panel for Zone 4. He set the toolbox down, the sound of metal on marble echoing in the empty hallway. He popped the panel, pulled out the multimeter, and STA route checking the voltage. He didn't hear them approach. He felt the shift in air pressure. Someone was standing too close. He's doing it again, Catherine. A man's voice said, Shah RP, and clipped. Touching everything. Like a goddamn RATHON. Marcus didn't look up from the wiring diagram. He kept his focus on the leads. He knew that voice. Richard Vance. Self-made real estate mogul, current husband of Catherine Vance, and a man who spoke like every word cost him $1,000 arrest. Richa RD, please, a woman's voice replied. It was Catherine. Lower. Tired. Not here. Not here. Richa RD's voice rose slightly. We're at a fundraiser for pediatric neurology, and my stepson is rubbing his hands all over the waitstaff's uniforms. It's EMBA harassing. It's a liability. Marcus felt a small hand brush against his leg. He froze that it wasn't a brush. It was a deliberate movement. Small fingers, L to the touch, traced the seam of his jeans, right at the knee. They moved up way RD, slow and methodical, mapping the contour of his thigh, the edge of his utility belt. Marcus finally looked down. The kid was small, maybe 7. Dark hair combed neatly, pa root on the side. He wore a stiff white shirt and a little navy blue suit that probably cost more than Marcus's truck. The kid's eyes were open but unfocused, milky in the low light. Blind Jonah Marcus had seen pictures. Surveillance photos he'd taken himself, years ago, from a rooftop in Kabul. He'd never seen the kid in person. Jonah's fingers reached the edge of Marcus's tool belt. They paused on the leather, then moved to the hip. The kid's head tilted, as if listening to something only he could hear. Jonah, stop that, Catherine said, her voice strained. She reached out, but didn't touch him. Come away from there. Jonah didn't move. His fingers pressed against Marcus's left hip, right where the SCAR tissue was thickest beneath the denimed. 3 inches, Jonah whispered. His voice was clear, high, but devoid of inflection. Left side. Entry wound. The hallway went dead silent. Richard RD stopped pacing. Catherine's hand flew to her throat. Marcus didn't breathe. He kept his face neutral. He'd been scanned by better sensors than this. But he hadn't expected a kid to pick up on a SCA, or that was 8 years old, faded, and buried under layers of clothing and SCAR tissue. Don't be ridiculous, Richard snapped, recovering first. He stepped four-way RD, his polished dress shoes clicking on the marble. He's memorized something from a documentary or a video game. Kids obsessed with that Melita Re nonsense. No, Jonas said. He leaned in closer, his nose NEARLY touching M.A. Ruckus's belt buckle. He sniffed. Once. Deep. Gun oil. And cordite. And sweat. Not deodorant. Sweat. Like the locker room at the base. M.A. Ruckus's jaw tightened. He hadn't worn cologne in years. Just ivory soap and water. But the residue of his past, the oils he used to maintain his hair, are the faint chemical ghost of the range. Those didn't wash out easily. Jonah, that's enough, Catherine said, sharper now. She grabbed the kid's shoulder. Apologized to the technician. Jonah ignored her. His fingers moved to M.A. Ruckus's neckline, tracing the edge of his collar. Your breathing is wrong, the kid said. Too controlled. You're holding it. Like you're waiting for a signal. You're Melita Re. Rich ARD grabbed Jonah's ARM, pulling him back hard enough to make the kid stumble. I said that's enough. Security. Two men in RK suits read from the ballroom entrance. They didn't rush. They just stood there, blocking the hallway, their hands hovering in their belts. M.A. Ruckus slowly straightened up. He didn't reach for his tools. He looked at Richard. Sir, I'm just here to fix the AC. Work order 4492B. I don't see what your work order is, Richard hissed. You're disturbing the guests. Get out. He's not a technician, Jonas said. He'd stopped struggling against Richard's grip. He was facing M.A. Ruckus now, his sightless eyes fixed on a point slightly to M.A. Ruckus's left. He's not supposed to be here. He's the one Dad talked about. The one who ride him. Catherine gasped. It was a small, choked sound. She looked at M.A. Ruckus, really looked at him for the first time. Her face was pale under the makeup, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with a broken air conditioner. M.A. Ruckus didn't move. He held her gaze. He saw the recognition there, buried under layers of denial and expensive skinkery. She knew. She'd always known to remove him, Richard repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Now, one of the security guys stepped four-way road. He was younger, built like a linebacker. He reached for M.A. Ruckus's ARM. M.A. Ruckus didn't pull away. He let the guy grab him. Then, in one smooth motion, he twisted his ARM free, using the momentum to pivot his body. His left knee screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He grabbed the security guy's wrist, applied pressure to the radial nerve, and the guy's hand went numb. He dropped his grip instantly. M.A. Ruckus didn't escalate. He just stood there, breathing evenly, his eyes still on Catherine. Ma'am, he said, his voice flat, devoid of accent or emotion. I'm just here to fix the HVAC. He bent down, picked up his multimeter, and placed it carefully in the toolbox. He closed the lid with a soft click. Jonah was ring at him, his head tilted at a different angle now. He was listening to the rhythm of M.A. Ruckus's movements, the specific weight of the tools, the way his boots settled on the marble. You shoot left now, Jonah whispered. Because of the shoulder. But you're right-handed. You were shot in the left deltoid. It healed, but the muscle density is different. You compensate. Richard's face turned a mottled purple. He released Jonah and lunged for M.A. Ruckus. But Catherine caught his ARM. Richard, don't. Get him out of here. Richard ROA read at the security that the second RD moved in, more cautious this time. M.A. Ruckus didn't resist. He let them guide him, not roughly, but firmly. Tower RD the service elevator. He kept his eyes four-way RD, his expression blank. He'd been escorted out of worse places. As they passed Jonah, the kid reached out again. This time, M.A. Ruckus didn't stop him. Jonah's fingers found the chain around M.A. Ruckus's neck, the one he kept tucked under his shirt. He pulled it out. A dog tag, and a small, brass compass. The glass was cracked. The needle gone. Jonah ran his thumb over the engraving on the back of the compass. His lips moved, silently forming the words he couldn't see but could feel. For Jonah. Stay sha RP. M.A. Ruckus felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He reached up, gently uncurled the kid's fingers from the compass, and tucked it back under his shirt. He looked at Catherine one last time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The elevator doors opened. The Gua RDS pushed him inside. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of Jonah's pale face and Richa RD's furious shouting. Marcus leaned against the wall as the elevator descended. He closed his eyes, listening to the cables grind. He could still smell the gun oil on his own skin, mixed with the cloying scent of Catherine's perfume. He'd spent 5 years avoiding this. 5 years working shit jobs, fixing other people's climate control, staying invisible. He'd thought he could keep the promise by staying away. He'd thought the kid was better off not knowing. That he was wrong. That the elevator hit the ground floor. The doors opened to the loading dock, smelling of diesel and wet. Ca Riboe Road. Marcus picked up his toolbox. He walked out into the cold night air, past the idling delivery trucks and the smokers huddled by the dumpsters. He didn't look back at the glowing facade of the Vance Foundation. He walked to his truck, an old Ford F-150 with primer spots on the fender and a cracked leather seat. He tossed the toolbox in the bed, climbed in, and root the engine. The radio crackled to life, some country station playing a sad song about a soldier coming home. Marcus sat there for a long moment, his hands resting on the wheel. He could still feel the ghost of Jonah's fingers on his hip, the precise mapping of a wound he'd tried to forget. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He lit one with a cheap lighter, the flame trembling slightly in the wind. He took a long drag, the smoke filling his lungs, tasting like tar and regret. He looked at the compass through his shirt. He'd ride it for 8 years. He'd promised a dying man he'd give it to his son. He'd failed. He'd let Catherine's Fia and Richa RD's ambition keep him away. But the kid had found him anyway. Marcus exhaled slowly, watching the smoke dissipate in the cold air. He took another drag, then stubbed the cigarette out in the overflowing ashtray. He put the truck in Hayar and pulled away from the curb, merging into the late-night traffic. He didn't go back to his apartment. He drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone Han. He parked in the back, under a flickering streetlight. He grabbed his toolbox and walked inside. He didn't order food. He just sat in a booth by the window, opened his laptop, and pulled up the schematics for the Vance Foundation's HVAC system. He studied the blueprints, tracing the ductwork, the electrical runs, the access points. He wasn't just fixing the AC anymore. He was mapping the terrain. He spent the next 3 hours working, his fingers moving with practiced precision over the keyboard ARD and the wiring diagrams. He noted the locations of the security cameras, the motion sensors, the blind spots in the service hallways. He cross-referenced the HVAC layout with the building's architectural plans. He found 3 potential entry points that weren't on the security grid. All of them required crawling through dirty, narrow ducts. All of them led to the private residential floors above the foundation offices. He saved the files to an encrypted drive. He closed the laptop and leaned back, rubbing his gritty eyes. The diner was rooting to fill up with the EARLY morning shift change. Truckers, nurses, and insomniacs. He looked out the window at the gray dawn. Somewhere in that gleaming tower, a blind kid was waking up. A kid who could smell gunpowder and map SCARS with his fingertips. A kid who wasn't supposed to know he existed. Marcus finished his cold coffee. He stood up, left a 5 on the table, and walked back to his truck. He felt the weight of the compass against his chest, heavier than before. He'd made a promise. He'd failed to keep it the easy way. Now he'd have to keep it the hard way. He drove to a storage unit he rented under a false name. He unlocked the door, rolled up the corrugated metal shutter, and stepped inside. The unit smelled of dust and old paper. Stacked against the walls were boxes of his old HAR, field manuals, tactical vests, night vision goggles, and a locked Pelican case. He opened the case. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was an M4CA ribine. He hadn't touched it in years. He unwrapped it, checked the action, cleaned the BA rel. He loaded a magazine, chambered a round, and set the safety. He wasn't planning a war. He was planning a delivery. He spent the rest of the morning cleaning and maintaining the rifle, his movements methodical, his mind focused. He thought about Jonah's voice, the way he'd said entry wound, with such clinical precision. He thought about Catherine's face, the look of naked Fia, or when the kid mentioned the compass. He thought about Richa Road Vance, the man who'd ride his best friend's widow, and spent the last 5 years erasing every trace of the man who died protecting his country. Marcus didn't hate Richer Road. Hatred was a luxury he couldn't afford. But he despised what Richer Road represented. The casual disregard for sacrifice, the willingness to bury truth for profit. He finished cleaning the rifle and rewrapped it. He closed the Pelican case and secured it with 2 padlocks. He looked around the storage unit, at the relics of his old life. He didn't belong here anymore. He didn't belong in the world of gala dinners and pediatric neurology foundations. He belonged in the shadows. The places where promises were kept, no matter the cost. He locked the storage unit and walked back to his truck. He drove to a laundromat and washed his jumpsuit, sitting on a plastic chair for an hour while the machines hummed. He bought a burner phone from a bodega and programmed 1 number into it. A secure line he hadn't used since he left the teams. That he didn't call it. Not yet. He drove to a payphone outside a gas station, the kind with the cracked receiver and graffiti on the booth. He dialed the number from memory. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, it's Mitchell," Marcus said. He used his last name, the one that wasn't on the work order. "I need a favor." Location: the Vance Foundation. Residential level. High security. I need eyes on a kid. 7 years old. Blind. Name's Jonah. Timeline: 24 hours. I need to know his routine. School, meals, therapy. I need to know when he's alone. Copy. What's the play? Extraction. Non-lethal. I need to get him out without a scene. Risk assessment. High. Father figure is hostile. Mother is conflicted. Security is private, but trained. I'm going in through the service ducts. Backup. Negative. Solo. There was a pause on the line. You sure about this, Mitch? I'm sure. All right. I'll send the packet to the usual drop. Check it in 6 hours. Copy. Marcus hung up the phone. He walked back to his truck, his mind already running through the variables. Wind speed, ambient noise, thermal signatures. He'd done this 100 times before, but never for a kid. Never for a promise. That he drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, the kind that rented rooms by the hour. He paid cash for a room at the back, overlooking the highway. He sat on the bed, the mattress sagging under his weight, and waited. 6 hours later, he checked the encrypted server on his laptop. The packet was there. Floor plans, security schedules, staff rotations, Jonah's daily itinerary. It was all there, laid out in clean, precise lines. Jonah woke at 6:30 a.m., ate oatmeal with brown sugar, had a Braille lesson at 8 o'clock, physical therapy at 10 o'clock, lunch at noon, ART class at 2 o'clock, dinner at 6 o'clock, bedtime at 8:00, every hour accounted for. Every movement tracked. Except for one gap. Every Tuesday and Thursday, from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m., Jonah had independent sensory exploration in the solarium on the top floor. No staff, no cameras, just the kid and the plants. That was his window. Marcus studied the solarium layout. It was a glass enclosure, accessible only through a single reinforced door. The HVAC duct that served the solarium ran vertically through the building, connecting to the main utility chase on the 40th floor. The duct was 18 inches square, lined with insulation, and hadn't been cleaned in years. It was a tight fit, but it was doable. He spent the next 2 hours memorizing the route. He visualized every turn, every junction, every potential obstacle. He calculated the time it would take to traverse the duct, the noise he'd make, the risk of dislodging debris. He fell asleep fully clothed, his hand resting on the compass. He dreamed of Kabul, of the dust and the heat, of the weight of his best friend's body as he ride him out of the burning wreckage. He dreamed of the promise he'd made, whispered into a dying man's ear. I'll watch over him. I'll make sure he knows that he woke up at 5 p.m., his internal clock precise as ever. He got up, splashed cold water on his face, and ate a protein bar. He checked his hair one last time. The rifle stayed in the truck. He'd go in Uniremed. This wasn't a combat op. It was a rescue. He dressed in black, cargo pants, a long-sleeved shirt, soft-soled boots. He packed a small kit, a flashlight, a multi-tool, a bottle of water, and a small, Braille-labeled book he'd bought at a specialty store. It was a children's book about the ocean. He didn't know if Jonah liked the ocean, but it felt like the right thing to bring. He drove to the Vance Foundation, parking 3 blocks away in an underground garage that catered to building staff. He entered the service elevator at 6 p.m., CA wearing a fresh set of Apex climate control overalls and a new work order. The security guard at the desk didn't look up. Marcus was just another ghost in the machine. He rode the elevator to the 40th floor. The utility chase was hot, humid, and reeked of ozone and mold. He found the access panel for the solarium duct. He unscrewed the bolts, his movements silent and efficient. He peered into the darkness. The duct sloped downward at a steep angle. To sap a ring into the guts of the building, he checked his watch. 6:15 p.m. Jonah would be in the solarium for another 15 minutes. He took a deep breath, then crawled into the duct. The space was tight, pressing against his shoulders and hips. He moved slowly, his body sliding over the rough insulation, his progress measured in inches. He could hear the distant hum of the building's systems, the occasional clang of pipes expanding and contracting. He navigated 2 junctions, following the mental map he'd memorized. The air grew slower as he descended. He could smell the damp earth of the solarium's plants, the faint scent of chlorophyll and wet soil. He reached the final stretch. The duct opened into a large, grated vent overlooking the solarium. He peered through the grate. Below him, bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun, was Jonah. The kid was sitting on a woven mat, surrounded by potted palms and hanging vines. He was running his hands over a large, flat leaf, his face tilted toward the light. He was alone. Marcus studied him for a long moment. The kid was smaller than he'd looked in the hallway, more fragile, but there was a stillness to him, an intensity that reminded Marcus of a sniper waiting for the shot. He reached into his kit and pulled out the multi-tool. He selected the smallest screwdriver and began to quietly remove the screws securing the vent grate. One by one, he placed them in his pocket. The metal was cold against his fingers that he removed the final screw. The grate was loose. He pushed it gently, and it swung down on its hinges, silent on well-oiled BA rings. He lowered himself out of the duct, dropping lightly onto the tiled floor. He landed in a crouch, his boots making no sound. Jonah didn't react. He didn't rile. He just kept running his hands over the leaf. Marcus stood slowly. He looked at the kid, at the way the fading sunlight caught the fine hairs on his arms, at the slight furrow in his brow as he concentrated on the texture of the plant. Jonah, Marcus said quietly. The kid's head snapped up. His sightless eyes turned toward the sound, focusing on a point just past Marcus's shoulder. He didn't speak. He just listened. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the compass. He walked over and knelt in front of the kid. He held out the compass, the cracked glass catching the light. Jonah's hand reached out, his fingers brushing against Marcus's palm. He took the compass, his small hands closing around it. He ran his thumbs over the brass, over the missing needle, over the engraving on the back. He looked up, his face unreadable. "You came back," Jonah whispered. Marcus nodded. "I promised I would. Mom said you were gone. She was wrong. Dad said you'd come when I was ready. He was right." Jonah clutched the compass to his chest. "Are we leaving?" Marcus looked at the door. It was locked from the outside. The security cameras were offline in this sector, but only for another 12 minutes. After that, the night shift would start their rounds. "Yeah," Marcus said. "We're leaving." He stood and offered his hand. Jonah took it without hesitation. His grip was surprisingly strong. Marcus led him back to the vent. He lifted the kid up, helping him into the duct. He followed, pulling the grate back into place and securing it with the screws he'd saved. They crawled back through the darkness, the kid moving ahead of him with surprising agility, his hands and knees finding purchase on the insulated walls. They moved in silence, the only sound their breathing and the scrape of fabric against metal. They emerged into the utility chase on the 40th floor. Marcus replaced the access panel. He checked his watch. 6:28 p.m. 2 minutes to Spa-Re. He led Jonah to the service elevator. The guard was still at his desk, head bent over a crossword puzzle. Marcus pressed the button for the basement. The doors slid open. He ushered Jonah inside. As the doors closed, Jonah looked up at him. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," Marcus said. "Will Mom be there?" Marcus hesitated. "No, not yet." Is she in danger? No. But she's SCA red. Of you. Of the truth. The elevator reached the basement. The doors opened to the dimly lit parking garage. Mayor Cuss led Jonah to his truck. He opened the passenger door, helped the kid inside, and buckled the seatbelt. He tucked the compass into the kid's pocket. He got in the driver's side and STA route the engine. He pulled out of the garage, merging into the evening traffic. He drove without speaking, his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. Jonah sat quietly, his head resting against the seat, the compass clutched in his hand. After a few minutes, he spoke. What's it like? Outside. Mayor Cuss glanced at him. Loud. Smells like exhaust and fried food. But the air moves. It's not recycled. Is it to RK? Only if you don't know how to look. Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I can hear the wind. In the vents. It sounds different here. It is. Are you taking me to Dad? Mayor Cuss's throat tightened. No. I'm taking you to a place where you can Leah RN to use what he gave you. The compass. No. The sight. Jonah didn't ask what that meant. He just leaned his head back and closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt, the hum of the engine, the pulse of the city outside. Mayor Cuss drove through the night, leaving the gleaming towers of the Vance Foundation behind. He drove Tower RD, the edge of the city, Tower RD, the industrial pa RKS, and the abandoned Wari houses. Tower RD, the place where he'd stored the rest of his hair. He had a promise to keep. And for the first time in 8 years, he knew exactly where he was going. He looked at the kid, sleeping peacefully beside him, the compass glowing faintly in the dashboard RD light. He'd spent his life in the shadows. Now he was walking Tower RD, the light. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what he'd find there. He pressed the accelerator, the truck surging four-way RD into the darkness up behind them. The city lights faded. Ahead, the horizon was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The promise was kept. The mission was complete, but the war was just beginning. Chapter 1 ends. The motel room smelled like bleach and old coffee. Mayor Cuss sat on the edge of the bed, the thin mattress dipping under his weight. Jonah was curled up on the other bed, still wearing his rumpled suit from the gala. The kid was awake. Mayor Cuss could tell by the rhythm of his breathing, but he wasn't talking. He was just lying there, one hand resting on the compass on his chest, the other tracing the stitched pattern on the bedspread. Mayor Cuss looked at the cheap digital clock on the nightstand. 4:17 a.m. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the last 3 hours wiping down every surface he'd touched in the truck, checking the perimeter of the motel 3 times, and listening to the highway traffic outside. The roar of the semis was a constant, soothing white noise. It reminded him of the flight line. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the burner phone. He scrolled through the contacts until he found the number he'd programmed in EA Relier. He didn't dial it. He just STA read at the screen. He needed to make a call, but not yet. Not until he was sure they hadn't been followed. He looked over at Jonah. The kid's eyes were open, STA ring at the ceiling. Mayor Cuss could see the reflection of the flickering neon sign from the motel office in his pupils. Are you hungry? Mayor Cuss asked. That Jonah didn't respond for a long moment. Then he said, I can hear your stomach. It's making a hollow sound, like a drum. Mayor Cuss felt a twitch at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile. It was something else. Yeah, I could eat. There's a vending machine, Jonah said, at the end of the walkway. I can hear the compressor kicking on. It's old. Needs Freon. Mayor Cuss stood up. Stay here. I'll be right back. He walked to the door, checked the peephole, then stepped out into the cold. The asphalt of the parking lot was cracked and stained with oil. He walked to the vending machine, a relic from the 90s with faded graphics and a sticky dispenser tray. He fed in a couple of $RS and punched the buttons for 2 packages of peanut butter crackers and 2 bottles of water. He ride the loot back to the room. Jonah was sitting up now, his back against the headboy road. Mayor Cuss tossed him a pack of crackers and a bottle of water. Thanks, Jonah said. He tore open the package with his fingers, his movements precise. He ate slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly. Mayor Cuss ate his own crackers standing up, leaning against the wall by the window. He kept the curtain pulled back just an inch, watching the parking lot. A semi rumbled past on the highway, its headlights sweeping across the room. You're watching for them, Jonah said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Mayor Cuss said, They'll come looking. Eventually, Richa RD will call the police. Probably. Mom won't stop him. Mayor Cuss didn't say anything. He just watched the highway. She's afraid of him, Jonah said. She's afraid of what he'll do to the foundation, to her reputation. I know, Mayor Cuss said, but she's more afraid of you, Jonah added. She thinks you're going to tell me things. Things she wants me to forget. Mayor Cuss turned away from the window. He looked at the kid. What things? Jonah took a sip of water. About Dad. About how he died. About why he died. Mayor Cuss walked over and sat on the edge of his bed again. What did she tell you? She told me he was a hero, Jonah said. That he died saving his team. That he was a good man. That he loved me. He paused. But she never told me his name. Or what unit he was in. Or where he's buried. She just said overseas. That's not a place. That's a direction. Mayor Cuss felt a cold knot in his gut. Catherine had erased the man completely. She'd turned him into a myth, a sanitized version of a violent death. She told me not to talk about him, Jonah continued. She said it would make me sad. She said Richa Road didn't like it when I talked about him. Richa RD, Mayor Cuss said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. What does he do when you talk about your dad? Jonah's fingers tightened on the water bottle. He gets quiet. Then he leaves the room. Once, he broke a glass. Mom cleaned it up. She told me it was my fault for upsetting him. Mayor Cuss's jaw tightened. He'd seen men like Richa Road before. Men who used their power to control, to intimidate, to erase. They didn't need to hit you to break you. They just needed to control the narrative. She's not a bad person, Jonah said suddenly. She's just small. Richa Road makes her small. I know, Mayor Cuss said. He'd seen it in Catherine's eyes at the gala. The fear, the resignation. The way she'd looked at him, not with hatred, but with a desperate plea for him to go away, to let her keep her fragile peace. I'm not small, Jonah said. He said it quietly, but there was a steel in his voice that Mayor Cuss recognized. It was the same steel he'd heard in his best friend's voice when they'd been pinned down, waiting for extraction. No, Mayor Cuss said. You're not. Jonah finished his water and set the bottle on the nightstand. He picked up the compass again, running his thumb over the engraving. You knew him? My dad. Yeah, Mayor Cuss said. I knew him. What was his name? Mayor Cuss closed his eyes for a second. He could still see the face, the dusty helmet, the blood. Christopher Vance. Jonah repeated the name, whispering it to himself. Christopher Vance. He was the best sniper I ever worked with, Mayor Cuss said. He could read the wind like it was a book. He could hit a target at 1,000 yards in a crosswind. And he never missed. Why did he die? Jonah asked. The question was blunt, clinical. There was no emotion in it, just a need for data. Mayor Cuss took a deep breath. We were on a reconnaissance mission. Northern Helmand. We got compromised. Chris was providing overwatch from a ridge. When the shit hit the fan, he stayed in position to cover our withdrawal. He took 3 rounds to do it. He bought us time. Did it hurt? Jonah asked. Yeah, Mayor Cuss said. It hurt. Did he scream? No, Mayor Cuss said. He sang. Jonah tilted his head. Sang. He sang that song. The one about the Green Beret. He sang it all the way through. Kept singing until the medevac bird landed. Jonah was quiet for a long time. He processed the information, his fingers still moving over the compass. He wasn't afraid. No, Mayor Cuss said. He wasn't. And UCA ride him out. Yeah. Through the fire. Yeah. With the bullets hitting the dirt around you. Yeah. Jonah nodded slowly. That's why you limp. Your left knee. You took a round there too, didn't you? Mayor Cuss looked at the kid. Yeah, I did. But you kept going. I had to. Because of the promise. Mayor Cuss didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jonah set the compass down on the bed. He swung his legs over the side and stood up. He walked over to the window, his movements sure and confident despite his blindness. He stood next to Mayor Cuss, his shoulder brushing against Mayor Cuss's arm. I want to Leah RN, Jonah said. I want to Leah RN how to do what you do. How to track. How to read the wind. How to be a sniper. Mayor Cuss looked down at him. The kid was serious. There was no trace of a child's fantasy in his voice. Just a cold, hard determination. It's not a game, Jonah, Mayor Cuss said. It's not something you Leah RN from a book. It's ugly. It's messy. It stays with you. I know, Jonah said. I can feel it. In your hands. In the way you move. In the way you smell. You carry it with you. Like a second skin. Marcus was silent. The kid was right. He did carry it. Every SCAR, every nightmare, every ghost. It was part of him now. I don't want to be a sniper, Jonas said. I want to be able to see. Like you do. Not with my eyes. With everything else. Marcus understood. The kid didn't want to kill. He wanted to perceive. He wanted to understand the world in a way that his blindness couldn't limit. He wanted to turn his disability into a weapon. All right, Marcus said. I'll teach you. Jonah's face didn't change. He didn't smile. He just nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. First lesson, Marcus said. We leave. Now, before the sun comes up. He stood up, an STA route packing. He gathered his AR, checked the locks on the door, and pulled the curtains shut. He moved with a purpose, his movements economical and silent. Jonas stood by the window, listening. The truck is parked 3 spaces to the left. The engine is cold. The oil pan is leaking. It's dripping onto the asphalt. 1 drop every 7 seconds. Marcus looked at the kid. He was impressed. The leak was real. He'd noticed it yesterday, but hadn't bothered to fix it. The kid had picked it up in less than an hour. Good, Marcus said. That's your first lesson. Observation. Details. Everything leaves a trace. He handed Jonah his jacket. It was too big for the kid, but it would keep him warm. He zipped it up and pulled the hood over Jonah's head. Stay close, Marcus said. And don't make a sound. He opened the door and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of diesel and dew. He led Jonah to the truck, his hand on the kid's shoulder, guiding him around the puddles and the oil stains. He opened the passenger door and helped Jonah inside. He buckled the seatbelt, then walked around to the driver's side. He got in and STA rooted the engine. The truck rumbled to life, the sound echoing in the empty parking lot. He pulled out of the space and drove toward the exit. As they passed the motel office, he saw the clerk looking up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing as he watched the truck. Marcus didn't slow down. He turned onto the access road and merged onto the highway. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. That he drove in silence, heading east, away from the city. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to keep moving. Jonas sat quietly beside him, his head resting against the window. After a few miles, he spoke. Where are we going? Somewhere they won't look. Marcus said, the mountains. Yeah, the mountains. Good, Jonas said. I can hear the wind there. It's cleaner. Marcus glanced at him. The kid was already adapting. Already learning. Already seeing. He looked back at the road. The highway stretched out before him, empty and endless. He pressed the accelerator, the truck picking up speed. He had a kid in the passenger seat, a compass in his pocket, and a promise to keep. And for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he was doing. The mountains rose up out of the flatland like jagged teeth. Marcus drove the truck up a winding dirt road that hadn't seen pavement in 20 years. The suspension groaned with every pothole, and the cab filled with the smell of dust and pine sap. Jonah sat quietly, his head tilted toward the open window, letting the wind hit his face. He wasn't talking. He was listening. Marcus hadn't spoken since they left the motel. He was focused on the road, on the feel of the truck, on the silence of the forest around them. He'd driven this route before, years ago, when he needed to disappear. The cabin wasn't on any map. It didn't have electricity or running water. It had a wood stove, a hand pump for water, and a roof that only leaked in 3 places. He pulled into a clear ring about a mile from the main road. The cabin sat there, looking smaller and more dilapidated than he remembered. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the porch sagged under the weight of winter snow. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. We're here, Marcus said. Jonah didn't move. He was still listening. The roof leaks, he said. Northwest corner. The chimney is drawing poorly. There's a nest in the flue. Mice in the walls. And the well pump is failing. The pressure tank is waterlogged. Marcus looked at him. How do you know that? Sound, Jonas said. The wind hits the shingles differently where the nails are loose. The chimney has a whistle when the wind blows from the west. The mice scratch in a rhythm, 3 quick, 1 long. And the pump kicks on every 4 minutes. But the pressure gauge doesn't move. Americus felt a chill run down his spine. The kid wasn't guessing. He was right. Every detailed, "Get your stuff," Americus said. He grabbed his toolbox and the duffel bag from the bed of the truck. He walked around to Jonah's side and helped him out. The kid's boots hit the dirt, and he immediately oriented himself, facing the cabin. Americus led him up the creaky steps onto the porch. He unlocked the door with a key he kept on a nail under the eaves. The door swung open with a groan. The cabin was one room. A bed in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove. Dust covered everything. Cobwebs hung from the rafters. It smelled of mildew and old smoke. Jonah walked in, his hand trailing along the wall. He moved with confidence, navigating the space without hesitation. He found the table, the chairs, the stove. He ran his fingers over the cast iron, the wood grain, the dust. "It's small," he said. "It's enough," Americus said. He dropped his hayar and walked over to the woodpile outside. He grabbed an arum load of dry kindling and a few splits of oak. He brought them inside and root the fire. It took him a few tries, but soon the kindling caught, and the wood began to crackle and pop. Smoke filled the cabin, stinging Americus's eyes, but he didn't open the damper yet. He wanted the heat to build first. Jonah stood by the stove, his hands outstretched, feeling the warmth. "The fire is uneven," he said. "The wood on the left is drier. It's burning faster. You need to turn the log." Americus looked at the fire. The kid was right. Again, he used a poker to turn the log, adjusting the airflow. The fire steadied, burning with a more consistent flame. "You're good at this," Americus said. "I'm good at listening," Jonas said. "Everything talks. Wood, metal, water, air. You just have to know how to hear it." Americus nodded. He'd read that lesson the hard way. In the field, your life depended on your ability to read the environment. The kid had been born with that skill. He walked over to the hand pump by the sink. He primed it, pumping the handle until water gurgled and spat out. The water was ice cold, tinged with iron. He filled a bucket and set it on the stove to heat. He turned to Jonah. "First lesson. Water." Jonah tilted his head. "Water. Yeah," Americus said. "Everything starts with water. Finding it, purifying it, conserving it. In the field, water is more important than food, more important than ammunition." He walked over to the sink and pumped another bucket. He handed it to Jonah. "Feel it." Jonah took the bucket. He ran his hands through the water, feeling the temperature, the viscosity, the sediment. "It's cold. There's iron in it. And silt. From the bottom of the well." "Good," Americus said. "Now, how do you make it safe to drink?" Jonah thought for a moment. "Boil it, or filter it, or use iodine tablets." "Right," Americus said. "But what if you don't have any of those?" Jonah was quiet. He dipped his fingers back into the water, swirling it around. "You can use the sun. Put it in a clear or bottle. Leave it in the sun for 6 hours. UV kills the bacteria." Americus raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you are in that?" "Internet," Jonah said. "Braille websites. Survival forums. I read a lot." Of course he did. The kid had been trapped in a world of silence and darkness, but he'd found a way to connect. To RN. To prepper. "All right," Americus said. "That works. But it's slow. What if you need water now?" Jonah thought again. He pet up a handful of water, let it run through his fingers. "You can use cloth. A bandana. Filter out the big stuff. Then boil it fast. The heat kills the rest." "Better," Americus said. "But there's another way. A faster way. If you're in a hurry." Jonah waited. Americus walked over to the wood stove. He grabbed a clean rag and dipped it into the hot water from the bucket on the stove. He wrung it out, then held it over the steam rising from the bucket. He let the steam condense on the rag, then wrung it out into a cup. "Solar still," Americus said. "Using the heat from the stove. You get clean water in minutes, not hours." Jonah reached out. Americus handed him the cup. The kid felt the water, the temperature, the purity. "It's clean," he said. "No silt. No iron." "Exactly," Americus said. "Observation. Adaptation. Improvisation. That's what keeps you alive." Jonah nodded. He understood. He was already applying the principles. Americus poured the rest of the hot water into a basin. "Wash up. We've got work to do." Jonah didn't argue. He stripped off his suit jacket and shirt, his movements efficient. He washed his face, his hands, his neck. The water was cold, but he didn't flinch. He was used to discomfort. Americus watched him. The kid was thin, but not frail. There was muscle there, hidden under the skin. He'd been in physical therapy. That was clear. He knew how to use his body. That when Jonah was finished, Americus handed him a clean t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants he'd brought from the truck. They were too big, but they'd worked. That Jonah dressed quickly. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, his hands in his lap. "What's next?" he asked. "Firewood," Americus said. "We need to stock the woodshed before the storm hits." Jonah tilted his head. "Storm. Weather report on the radio," Americus said. "Cold front moving in. Snow by tomorrow night." "I heard it," Jonah said. The static on the radio changed. The pitch. It got higher. "That means moisture in the air." Americus nodded. "Good. You're listening." He grabbed an axe and a sled from the corner of the cabin. He handed Jonah a pair of work gloves. "Put these on, and stay behind me. Watch where I swing." Jonah took the gloves and pulled them on. They were huge on him, but they'd protect his hands. Americus led him out to the woodpile. He showed him how to stack the wood, how to select the right pieces, how to load the sled. He demonstrated the swing of the axe, the ARC, the follow-through. He split a few logs, the sound of the blade biting into the wood echoing in the clear ring. Jonah listened. He didn't try to swing the axe. He just watched, his head tracking the movement, his hands mimicking the grip. After a dozen swings, Americus stopped. He was sweating despite the cold. He leaned the axe against the woodpile and looked at Jonah. "Your turn," he said. Jonah didn't hesitate. He walked over to the woodpile, selected a log, and placed it on the stump. He adjusted his grip on the axe, his hands finding the balance point. He took a deep breath, centered himself, and swung. The blade hit the log, biting in but not splitting it. The impact jarred his arms, but he held on. Again, Americus said. Jonah reset. He swung again. This time, the log split cleanly, the two halves falling away. Americus nodded. "Good. Feel the weight. Feel the resistance. Don't fight it. Use it." Jonah split another log. And another. His movements became smoother, more efficient. He wasn't strong, but he was precise. He used the momentum, the angle, the physics of the swing. They worked for an hour. By the time they finished, the woodshed was half full. Jonah was sweating, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he didn't complain. He just kept working. Americus called a halt. He led Jonah back to the cabin. They sat by the stove, warming their hands. Americus poured 2 cups of the purified water and handed one to Jonah. The kid drank it down, his throat working. He set the cup down and leaned back against the wall. "I'm tired," he said. "You should be," Americus said. "You worked hard." "I liked it," Jonah said. "The axe. The wood. The sound it makes when it splits. It's honest." Americus looked at him. "Honest?" "Yeah," Jonah said. "It doesn't lie. If you swing wrong, it tells you. If you swing right, it rewards you. It's not like people. People lie all the time." Americus didn't disagree. He'd spent his life dealing with liars, politicians, bureaucrats, men like Richard Vance. The kid had figured it out. EARLY. "Rest," Americus said. "I'll finish up outside." He stood and walked back out to the woodshed. He spent another hour stacking wood, checking the roof, securing the door. He worked until the light faded and the temperature dropped. When he came back inside, Jonah was asleep on the bed, curled up under a blanket. The compass was in his hand, resting on his chest. Americus stood over him for a long moment. He looked at the kid's face, relaxed in sleep. He looked younger, vulnerable. But Americus knew better. The kid wasn't vulnerable. He was resilient. He'd survived a world of silence and lies. He'd found his way to the truth. And now he was learning how to survive in the real world. Americus walked over to the stove and added another log. He banked the fire, adjusting the damper to keep it burning slow through the night. He sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the darkness. The wind was picking up, whistling through the cracks in the walls. Snow was coming. He thought about Catherine, about Richard, about the life he'd left behind. He thought about the promise he'd made to Chris. He thought about the kid sleeping 10 feet away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the compass. He held it in his hand, feeling the weight, the cold brass, the missing needle. He'd spent 8 years running from this moment. 8 years hiding in the shadows. But he wasn't running anymore. He had a kid to train, a promise to keep, and a war to fight. That he looked at Jonah. The kid stirred in his sleep, his fingers tightening on the compass. Marcus closed his hand around his own compass. He felt the engraving, the words that had guided him for so long. Stay sha rp. He would. For Chris. For Jonah. For himself. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, it was warm. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of peace. It wouldn't last. He knew that. But for now, it was enough. The snow sta route falling just after midnight. Marcus he rd it before he saw it. The change in the wind, the way the flakes hissed against the window glass. He'd slept in the chair, his boots propped on the rth, the rifle across his lap. He woke to the silence, the deep, muffled quiet that only fresh snow brings. Jonah was still asleep on the bed, the blanket pulled up to his chin. The compass was tucked inside his shirt now, the outline visible against his chest. Marcus watched him for a minute, noting the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the occasional twitch of his fingers. The kid was exhausted. The work yesterday had taxed muscles that hadn't been used to that degree before. Marcus stood up slowly, a rifle not to creak the floorboard ards. He walked to the window and looked out. The world was white. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bowed under the weight. The road was gone, erased by the storm. They were cut off. Good. He walked to the stove and added another log. The fire had burned down to coals, but it was still putting out heat. He stoked it, feeding the flames until they caught again. He pumped some water and set it to boil for coffee. He didn't have any cream or sugar, but he had the grounds. It would be bitter, but it would be hot. He turned back to Jonah. The kid was awake, his head turned toward the stove. His nostrils fla ring slightly. Coffee, Jonah said. Dark roast. Burnt. From a tin can. Not fresh ground. Marcus grunted. You got all that from the smell? And the sound of the water boiling, Jonah said. It's different when it's coffee. The bubbles smaller. More consistent. Marcus poured 2 cups of the black sludge. He handed one to Jonah. The kid took it, his small hands wrapping around the ceramic, absorbing the heat. It's hot, Jonah said. Too hot to drink yet. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. Marcus sat back down in his chair. He sipped his own coffee, ignoring the burn on his tongue. It tasted like mud, but it was caffeine. He needed it. We're snowed in, Marcus said. Road's gone. We're not going anywhere for a couple of days. Jonah nodded. He didn't seem concerned. The snow is heavy. Wet. It'll stick. The temperature is dropping. 22 degrees now. It'll be colder tonight. You're right again, Marcus said. How do you know the temperature? Air density, Jonah said. Sound travels slower in cold air. I can hear the delay in the echoes off the mountain, and the way the wood pops in the stove. It's tighter in the cold. Marcus shook his head. The kid was a natural. He had an innate understanding of physics, of thermodynamics, of acoustics. It was like he'd been born to be a tracker, a sniper, a survivor. Lesson 2, Marcus said. Tracking. Jonah tilted his head. Tracking. Yeah, Marcus said. Finding signs. Reading the ground. Following a trail. He stood up and walked to the door. He opened it, letting in a blast of cold air. Snow blew in, melting on the floorboard ards. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots sinking into 6 inches of fresh powdered. He turned back to Jonah. Come on. Jonah set his coffee down and stood up. He walked to the door, his hand trailing along the wall. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching on the snow. He didn't hesitate. He just stood there, his head tilted, his nostrils fla ringed. You were here, Jonah said. 5 minutes ago. Your boots left a deeper impression on the left side. You favor your right leg. The snow melted where you stood. It's refreezing now. The crystals different. Marcus nodded. Good. Now follow me. He walked out into the clear ring, his boots leaving a clear trail. He walked in a wide circle, then doubled back, crossing his own tracks. He stopped and looked back at Jonah. The kid was standing at the edge of the porch, his head moving slightly as he tracked the prints. He took a step forward, then another. He didn't look down. He looked straight ahead, his head turning as he followed the trail. He walked the circle, his steps sure. When he reached the point where Marcus had crossed his own tracks, he paused. He knelt down, his gloved hand hovering over the prints. You crossed here, Jonah said. Your right boot is deeper. You were CA-ring something. The weight shifted, and you paused. For 3 seconds. You looked over your shoulder. Marcus felt a surge of pride. The kid wasn't just seeing the tracks. He was interpreting them. He was understanding the story they told. Why did I look over my shoulder? Marcus asked. Because you heard something, Jonah said. A branch breaking. Upwind. To the north. Something heavy. A deer maybe. Or a bear. Marcus smiled. Close. It was a squirrel. In the pine tree above me. Jonah nodded. The acoustics. The sound traveled down the trunk. It sounded heavier than it was. Exactly, Marcus said. Context. Environment. You can't read a track without reading the land around it. He spent the next 2 hours teaching Jonah the basics. How to identify boot prints. How to measure stride length. How to determine direction of travel by the pressure of the heel. He showed him how to spot disturbed vegetation, broken twigs, displaced rocks. He taught him how to age a track by the way the snow melted around it, by the way the edges crystallized. Jonah absorbed it all. He moved through the snow with a grace that belied his blindness. He didn't stumble. He didn't falter. He used his senses, touch, sound, smell, to navigate the terrain. By the time they finished, the snow had stopped falling. The sun was out, weak and pale, but it was enough to cast long shadows across the clear ring that Marcus led Jonah back to the cabin. They warmed themselves by the stove, drinking the last of the coffee. You're a natural, Marcus said. You've got a gift. Jonah didn't respond. He was quiet, processing. Finally, he said, it's not a gift. It's necessity. I can't see, so I have to pay attention. To everything. Otherwise, I'm lost. Marcus understood. For Jonah, survival wasn't a skill. It was a way of life. All right, Marcus said. Next lesson. Weapons. Jonah's head snapped up. Weapons. Yeah, Marcus said. You need to know how to defend yourself. How to use what's available. He walked over to the corner and picked up the pelican case. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the M4. He unwrapped it, revealing the matte black finish, the collapsible stock, the rail system. Jonah stood up and walked over. He reached out, his hands hovering over the rifle. He didn't touch it. He just felt the air around it, the heat it radiated, the energy it held. It's a rifle, Jonah said. M4CA Rabine. 5.56 millimeters, lightweight. Reliable. But it's been modified. The stock is adjustable. The trigger is lighter. The BA rel is free-floated. And it's been cleaned recently. Very recently. Marcus looked at him. How do you know it's been cleaned? The smell, Jonah said. CLP. Break-free. And the oil. It's fresh. It hasn't had time to polymerize. And the bolt CA wire group. It's smooth. No CA rebond buildup. Marcus was speechless. The kid was reading a weapon he couldn't see. He was identifying modifications, maintenance schedules, and chemical residues. Can I touch it? Jonah asked. Yeah, Marcus said. Go ahead. Jonah's hands closed around the rifle. He ran his fingers over the metal, the plastic, the webbing. He traced the contours of the receiver, the curve of the trigger the texture of the grip. He found the safety, the magazine release, the ridging handled. He handled the rifle with a reverence that surprised Marcus. He didn't wave it around. He didn't point it at anything. He just explored it, learning its shape, its balance, its weight. It's balanced, Jonah said. Slightly front-heavy, because of the BA rel. But the stock compensates. It's designed for close routers. But it's accurate up to 500 meters. Maybe more, with the right optic. Marcus nodded. You're right. It's a versatile platform. Jonah found the optic. An ACOG. He ran his fingers over the lenses, the reticle, the adjustment knobs. Trigicon. 4x magnification. Illuminated reticle. Tritium. It glows in the dark, but it's fading. Needs replacement. Marcus was amazed. The kid was right about everything. The optic was old, the tritium was dying. He'd been meaning to replace it. All right, Marcus said. Lesson 3. Marksmanship. He spent the rest of the day teaching Jonah the fundamentals. Sight alignment. Trigger control. Breathing. Follow-through. He didn't let him fire the weapon. Not yet. He just had him practice the motions, the dry-fire drills, the muscle memory. Jonah was a quick study. He understood the principles immediately. He didn't need to see the target. He could feel the alignment, the pressure, the rhythm. By evening, Jonah was exhausted again. But he was smiling. A small, subtle smile, but a smile nonetheless. Ruthless made a simple dinner, beans and rice, heated over the stove. They ate in silence, listening to the wind outside, the crackle of the fire, the occasional pop of a log. After dinner, Ruthless cleaned the rifle, re-oiling the PA-RTS, checking the springs, ensuring the function. Jonah sat nearby, listening, his head tilted, his fingers tapping out the rhythm of the cleaning process. When Ruthless was finished, he wrapped the rifle back in the oilcloth and secured it in the case. He looked at Jonah. The kid was asleep in the chair, his head lolling to one side. Ruthless picked him up gently and ried him to the bed. He tucked him in, covering him with the blanket. Jonah stirred, his hand reaching out, finding the compass under his shirt. He clutched it, his breathing evening out. Ruthless walked back to his chair. He sat down, the rifle case at his feet. He looked out the window at the moon, bright and cold, shining down on the snow-covered landscape. He thought about the day, the tracking, the rifle, the kid's incredible aptitude. He was more than a student. He was a prodigy, but he was also a target. Richard Road Vance wouldn't stop looking. He'd use every resource at his disposal to find them. The police, private investigators. Maybe worse, Ruthless had to be ready. He had to train the kid fast, faster than he'd ever trained anyone before. He looked at the compass in his hand. The needle was gone, but the direction was clear. He had a mission, and he wouldn't fail. Not again. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, it was quiet. And for the first time in a long time, Ruthless felt a sense of purpose. He had a kid to train, a promise to keep, and a war to win. The snow lasted 3 days. Ruthless used the time to drill Jonah relentlessly. Tracking in the snow became a daily ritual, with Ruthless laying complex trails that looped back on themselves, crossed streams, and climbed rocky slopes. Jonah followed them all, his accuracy improving with each session. The kid's ability to read the environment was no longer just impressive, it was terrifying. He could identify the species of a bird from the sound of its wings, tell the difference between a coyote's track and a wolf's by the pressure distribution, and predict the weather with an accuracy that rivaled the National Weather Service. On the morning of the 4th day, the clouds broke. The sun came out, hot and bright, reflecting off the snow and forcing Ruthless to squint. He stood on the porch, his breath fogging in the cold air, watching Jonah emerge from the tree-line. The kid was riding a rabbit, its neck broken with a single, precise twist. He'd set a SNA the night before, using a length of paracord and a sapling, just as Ruthless had shown him. Dinner, Jonah said, holding up the rabbit. His hands were raw and red from the cold, but his grip was steady. Good, Ruthless said. Clean it. Jonah sat on the edge of the porch, his back straight, and began the methodical process of skinning and gutting the animal. His fingers moved with a surgeon's precision, guided by touch rather than sight. He ried the entrails, saving the liver and heart, and scraped the carcass clean. He worked without flinching, without hesitation, his face a mask of concentration. Ruthless watched him, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. The kid was adapting. He was becoming a creature of the wild, shedding the softness of the city, the weakness of his former life. He was learning to survive. When Jonah was finished, Ruthless took the clean carcass and spitted it over the open fire. He seasoned it with salt and wild herbs he'd gathered from the south-facing slope, sage and juniper berries. The smell of roasting meat filled the clear ring, a primal aroma that made Ruthless's stomach growl. They ate in silence, tearing the meat from the bones with their teeth. The rabbit was tough, but it was protein. It was fuel. Ruthless ate sparingly, giving the larger portion to Jonah. The kid needed the calories. He was still too thin, his ribs visible under the oversized sweatshirt. After the meal, Ruthless handed Jonah a piece of rawhide and a bone awl. Make a sheath, he said, for the knife. Jonah felt the rawhide, testing its thickness, its flexibility. He began to cut and fold, his fingers working the material with a practiced ease. He'd made SNA res, fishing lures, and cordage over the past few days. He understood the properties of natural materials, how they stretched, how they held tension, how they failed. As Jonah worked, Americus cleaned his rifle. He disassembled it completely, laying the parts out on a SKR of oilcloth. He inspected each component, checking for cracks, for the microscopic signs of fatigue. He ran a bore snake through the BA cleaning the rifling, removing the copper fouling. He oiled the bolt CA wire group, ensuring smooth operation. He adjusted the iron sights, zeroing them for 100 meters. Jonah paused in his work, his head tilting toward the sound of the cleaning. "You're worried," he said. Americus didn't look up. "About what?" "About the rifle," Jonah said. "You're checking the extractor spring. It's weak. It might fail under rapid fire." Americus stopped. He looked at the extractor spring. It was slightly compressed, the coils closer together than they should be. It was a minor flaw, one that most repairers would overlook. But Jonah had heard it, the subtle change in the metallic ping as Americus tested the tension. "You're right," Americus said. He reached into his kit and pulled out a SPA spring. He replaced the old one, feeling the difference in tension. "How'd you know?" "Resonance," Jonah said. "The sound of the spring compressing. It's different when it's fatigued. It's a lower frequency, more of a thud than a ring." Americus shook his head. The kid's ring was beyond human. It was superhuman. It was a weapon in itself. "All right," Americus said. Lesson 4. Tactical movement. He spent the afternoon teaching Jonah how to move through the woods without making a sound, how to place his feet, rolling from heel to toe, distributing his weight to avoid snapping twigs, how to use the terrain for cover, staying low, using the shadows, how to control his breathing, slowing his heart rate, minimizing his silhouette. Jonah was a natural. He moved like a ghost, his footsteps silent, his presence undetectable. He used his blindness to his advantage, relying on his other senses to navigate, to anticipate obstacles, to detect threats. He didn't need to see the branches to avoid them. He could feel the air currents shifting around them. By dusk, they were both exhausted. They returned to the cabin, the air inside cold from the open door. Americus root the fire, piling on the wood, building it up to a ROA ring blaze. He pumped water and set it to boil, prep a ring for the cold night ahead. As the water heated, Americus pulled out a map of the region. It was old, creased, and stained with coffee and grease. He spread it out on the table, weighing down the corners with cans of beans. "We need to talk about the future," Americus said. Jonah finished his sheath, tying off the rawhide with a secure knot. He set the knife in its new home and walked over to the table. He ran his hands over the map, his fingers tracing the contours of the mountains, the rivers, the roads. "They're looking for us," Jonah said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Americus said. "Richer Road has resources, money, connections. He'll have the cops, the FBI, private investigators. They'll be checking airports, bus stations, rental cars. They'll be canvassing the array, questioning people. But not here," Jonah said. "Not this FARN. The snow slowed them down. And the cabin isn't on any map." "Not yet," Americus said. "But they'll find it eventually. They'll track the truck. They'll find the motel. They'll follow the trail." Jonah's fingers paused on a section of the map. "There's a cave, 2 miles northeast, high up on the ridge. It's dry, hidden. The entrance is behind a waterfall in the spring, but it's frozen now. We can cache supplies there. Fall back if they find the cabin." Americus looked at the map. He'd marked that cave years ago. It was a secondary shelter, a bolt hole. He hadn't mentioned it to Jonah. But the kid had found it on the map, his fingers reading the topographic lines, understanding the elevation, the concealment. "Good," Americus said. "We'll cache the essentials. Food, water, ammo, medical supplies. And the compass," Jonah said. "We leave a decoy. Something to misdirect them." Americus nodded. The kid was thinking tactically. He was thinking like a soldier. They spent the next 2 hours packing. Americus filled a backpack with freeze-dried rations, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, extra magazines, and a wool blanket. Jonah packed a smaller bag with his own supplies, his knife, his SNA rewire, his fire STA router, and his braille book. As they worked, Americus explained the concept of operational security, how to avoid patterns, how to VA routines, how to use deception. He taught Jonah about counter-surveillance, how to detect a tail, how to identify a stakeout. He explained the importance of compartmentalization, of limiting information, of trusting no one. Jonah listened intently, asking pointed questions, challenging assumptions. He understood the stakes. He understood the danger. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a combatant. When the packs were ready, Americus strapped on his rifle and slung the backpack over his shoulders. Jonah shouldered his own pack, his movements confident, his posture straight. They stepped out into the cold night. The moon was full, casting long, sharp shadows across the snow. The air was still, the silence absolute. Americus led the way, his boots crunching on the frozen crust. Jonah followed, his footsteps falling in Americus's tracks, his breathing steady and controlled. They moved quickly, efficiently, climbing the ridge, their path illuminated by the moonlight. The cave was exactly where Jonah had indicated, high up, hidden behind a curtain of icicles. The entrance was narrow, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. Inside, the cave was dry and cold. The air smelled of rock and bats. Americus set up a small, concealed lantern, its light reflecting off the walls. He cached the supplies in a deep alcove, covering them with a tarp and camouflage netting. Jonah explored the cave, his hands mapping the walls, the ceiling, the floor. "It's stable," he said. "No loose rock. Good drainage. The air flows from the back to the front. It'll disperse the smell of smoke." Americus was impressed. The kid had assessed the tactical viability of the location in minutes. He'd identified the strengths and weaknesses, the advantages and risks. If they spent an hour reinforcing the cache, camouflaging the entrance, and erasing their tracks. When they were finished, they crawled back out into the night. They stood on the ridge, looking down at the cabin, a small, dark speck in the vast white landscape. The wind was picking up, blowing snow off the peaks, obscuring their view. "We should go back," Jonah said. "The fire's low. The temperature's dropping." Americus nodded. He looked at the kid, his face pale in the moonlight, his eyes reflecting the stars. He was no longer the fragile, helpless child from the gala. He was a survivor. "A warrior, yeah," Americus said. "Let's go home." They turned and began the descent, their footsteps silent, their shadows merging with the darkness. Behind them, the cave remained hidden, a secret sanctuary in the heart of the wilderness. A place of last resort. Ahead of them, the cabin waited, a beacon of warmth in the freezing night. A temporary haven in a world that had read them enemies. Americus felt the weight of the compass against his chest. He felt the promise it represented. He felt the responsibility it demanded. He looked at Jonah, walking beside him, his steps sure, his spirit unbroken. The war had begun, and they were ready. The thaw came slow and mean. For a week, the days were just enough to turn the snow into a treacherous crust of ice, only to freeze solid again at night. Americus used the brutal conditions to push Jonah harder. They drilled movement over icy slopes, practicing self-arrest with ice axes and building snow shelters that could withstand the wind. Jonah's hands were constantly raw, his nails rimmed with black from the cold, but he never complained. He was learning to read the ice, to feel the microfractures under his boots, to hear the subtle groans of a slope under stress. One morning, Americus led him to a frozen waterfall a mile from the cabin. The ice was blue and thick, a vertical wall of frozen time. Americus set up a top rope anchor, hammering pitons into the rock above and running a static line through a series of carabiners. "Ice climbing," Americus said, his voice flat against the wind. "It's about balance, trust, and violence." Jonah stood at the base of the ice, his head tilted back, his sightless eyes tracking the contours of the frozen flow. He ran his gloved hands over the first few feet of ice, feeling the texture, the temperature, the stability. "It's not solid," Jonah said. "There's a seam. About 8 feet up. Left side. It's weaker. The ice is thinner there. It'll fracture if I place a tool there." Americus checked the spot Jonah had indicated. The kid was right. There was a hairline crack in the ice, a weak point that could cause a fall. Americus had missed it. "Good," Americus said. "Find your own path." He handed Jonah the climbing hair, 2 ice tools, and a pair of crampons. Jonah strapped the crampons onto his boots, the metal spikes biting into the ice at the base. He took the tools, testing their weight, the curve of the picks. Americus gave him a quick tutorial on the technique. The French technique for flat footing, the German technique for edging, the American technique for front pointing. He showed him how to swing the tools, how to place them securely, how to trust the placement. Jonah listened. Then he essayed route climbing. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He felt his way up the ice, his tools swinging in a rhythmic arc, his crampons biting in with a satisfying thunk. He moved slowly, deliberately, his body close to the ice, his weight centered. He reached the weak seam. He paused, his tool hovering over the ice. He adjusted his position, moving his right foot slightly to the right, finding a more solid purchase. He swung his left tool, placing it above the seam, in a thicker section of ice. He weighted it, testing the hold. It held. He continued climbing, his movements fluid, his breathing controlled. He reached the top of the waterfall, 100 feet of vertical ice, and Americus lowered him back down. When Jonah's feet touched the ground, he was breathing hard, his heart pounding, but his face was calm. He unbuckled the crampons and handed the tools back to Americus. Again, Jonah said that Americus nodded. He was pushing the kid to his limits, and the kid was pushing back. It was exactly what he needed. They climbed for 3 hours, running laps on the ice wall. Jonah's technique improved with each ascent. He became faster, more efficient, more confident. He sta route to anticipate the ice, to feel the vibrations, to hear the changes in the crystalline structure. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, painting the ice in shades of orange and pink. They descended back to the cabin, their bodies aching, their minds sharp. That night, as they ate a meager dinner of dehydrated stew, Americus spoke. "You're ready for the next phase." Jonah looked up from his bowl. "Phase? Combat medicine," Americus said. "Trauma CA how to treat a gunshot wound, how to stop a bleed, how to manage shock." Jonah's expression didn't change. He just nodded. Now, Americus said that he pulled out his medical kit, a compact trauma bag filled with tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, chest seals, and intravenous supplies. He laid everything out on the table, explaining the purpose of each item, demonstrating the proper application. He sta route with tourniquets. He showed Jonah how to apply a cat tourniquet to a limb, how to tighten it until the bleeding stopped, how to secure it in place. He had Jonah practice on his own ARM, on Americus's ARM, on a makeshift mannequin made from a sleeping bag and a water bladder. Jonah mastered the technique quickly. He understood the mechanics, the pressure points, the urgency. He learned how to improvise a tourniquet from a belt, a rope, a strip of cloth. Next, Americus taught him about junctional bleeding, wounds to the groin, the armpit, the neck. He showed him how to pack a wound with hemostatic gauze, how to apply direct pressure, how to use a pelvic binder. He explained the physiology of blood loss, the stages of shock, the importance of oxygen and circulation. Jonah absorbed the information, his fingers memorizing the textures of the gauze, the shape of the chest seals, the diameter of the 4 catheters. He asked questions. How much blood could a person lose before they died? How long could a brain survive without oxygen? What were the signs of a tension pneumothorax? Americus answered each question with clinical precision, his voice devoid of emotion. This wasn't a game. This was life and death. And Jonah needed to understand the reality of it. They practiced through the night, simulating Sheena Rios, a gunshot to the leg, a stab wound to the chest, a blast injury to the abdomen. Americus played the role of the casualty, screaming, convulsing, going into shock. Jonah responded, his movements calm, his actions decisive. He applied the tourniquet, packed the wound, sealed the chest, sta route in 4. By dawn, Jonah was exhausted, but he'd mastered the basics. He could treat a trauma patient with a competence that rivaled a paramedic. Americus looked at him, his face grim. "Remember this. You might have to use it. On me. Or on yourself." Jonah didn't respond. He just reached out and touched the compass under his shirt. He understood the gravity of the situation. He understood the risks that the next day, Americus introduced fire ARMS. He sta route with the basics, safety, handling, maintenance. He taught Jonah how to field strip the M4, how to clean it, how to reassemble it. He taught him how to load a magazine, how to chamber a round, how to clear or a malfunction. Jonah handled the rifle with a respect that bordered on reverence. He understood the power of the weapon, the lethality. He didn't treat it as a toy. He treated it as a tool. A tool for survival. Marcus set up a makeshift range behind the cabin, using a berm of snow and ice as a backstop. He sta route with dry fire drills, having Jonah practice his stance, his grip, his trigger control. He taught him how to breathe, how to relax, how to focus. Then he introduced live fire. He sta route with single shots, having Jonah fire from a prone position, then a seated position, then a standing position. He taught him how to compensate for the recoil, how to manage the muzzle rise, how to acquire the target. Jonah was a natural shooter. His lack of sight forced him to rely on his other senses, the feel of the rifle, the sound of the shot, the vibration of the recoil. He developed a sixth sense for the weapon, an intuitive understanding of its behavior. He sta route hitting targets at 50 meters, then 100 meters. His groups were tight, his consistency remarkable. He wasn't just shooting. He was communicating with the rifle, with the bullet, with the environment. Marcus watched him, a sense of awe creeping into his chest. The kid was a prodigy, a savant. He was mastering skills that took most soldiers years to perfect, and he was doing it in weeks. But Marcus knew that skill wasn't enough. He needed discipline. He needed judgment. He needed to understand the moral weight of taking a life. He sat Jonah down and talked to him about the ethics of combat, about the rules of engagement, about proportionality, about discrimination. He told him about the times he'd had to make impossible choices, about the burden of those choices, about the ghosts that haunted him. Jonah listened, his face solemn. He didn't speak. He just absorbed the lessons, his fingers tracing the engraving on the compass. You don't kill unless you have to, Marcus said. You don't kill for revenge. You don't kill for sport. You kill to protect, to survive, to keep a promise. Jonah nodded. He understood. He'd already made his choice. He'd chosen to fight, to survive, to honor his father's memory. As the sun set on the seventh day, Marcus stood on the ridge, looking out over the valley. The ice was melting, the rivers were swelling, the world was waking up from its winter sleep. He looked at Jonah, standing beside him, his face turned toward the wind, his hand resting on the compass. The kid was no longer a boy. He was a soldier, a warrior, a force of nature. Marcus felt the weight of his promise. He felt the responsibility of his mission. He felt the inevitability of the conflict to come. He looked at the compass. The needle was gone, but the direction was clear. They were ready. The first week of April brought rain. It hammered the roof of the cabin, turning the snow into a muddy slurry that sucked at their boots and made the climb to the cave a treacherous slog. Marcus used the miserable weather to refine Jonah's urban survival skills, transforming the one-room cabin into a mock cityscape. He taught Jonah how to navigate a room using a 4ARM shield, how to clear our corners by feeling the air displacement, and how to identify objects in a cluttered space by their acoustic signature. Jonah learned to distinguish a metal folding chair from a wooden one by the resonance of a tap, and to identify a staircase by the specific echo of his own footsteps. One afternoon, as the rain beat a steady rhythm on the tin roof, Marcus froze. He held up a hand, silencing Jonah mid-sentence. He cocked his head, his ears straining against the ambient noise. There, underneath the rain, almost imperceptible, was the low thrum of a diesel engine. It was too rhythmic for a truck, too sustained for a generator. It was a helicopter. Jonah went still, his head tilting. Black Hawk, he whispered. 60L. Tail rotor RPM is slightly off. It's coming from the south-southwest. 3 miles out. It's not landing. It's circling. Marcus was already moving. He killed the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. He grabbed the rifle and the go bag, shoving the remaining supplies into a pack. They found the truck, he said, his voice a low growl. Or a thermal scan picked up the cabin. Jonah didn't panic. He moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing his own pack, his knife, and the compass. He felt his way to the back wall, where Marcus had cut a small escape hatch behind a stack of firewood. He sta route shoving the wood aside, creating a pile of kindling for a distraction. 2 minutes. Emeircus said, checking his watch. He moved to the front window, peeling back a corner of the TARP he used for blackout. He scanned the sky through a gap in the trees. He spotted it, a RK speck against the gray clouds, moving with a predatory slowness. It was too high for a rescue mission. It was a CRCH platform. They're using FLIR, Jonas said. His EA are still tuned to the helicopter's engine. The infrared is sweeping the ground. They're looking for heat signatures. The cabin's 2 WRM. We need to CO it down. Emeircus nodded. He grabbed a bucket of water and doused the wood stove, sending a cloud of steam hissing into the room. He opened the dampers, venting the heat outside. He grabbed the blankets from the bed, scattering them to disrupt the thermal profile. He moved with a frantic energy, his mind racing through the protocols for evading aerial surveillance. Jonah finished clearing the hatch. He crawled through, dropping into the mud on the other side. Emeircus followed, sealing the hatch behind him with a piece of BARK and some moss. He grabbed Jonah's ARM, pulling him into the dense cover of the pine trees. They moved downhill, away from the cabin, using the thickest brush for cover. The helicopter was getting closer, its sound growing louder, more defined. Emeircus could feel the vibration of the rotors in his chest. He pulled Jonah down behind a fallen log, pressing him into the wet EART. Don't move, Emeircus whispered. Don't breathe deep. They lay there, buried in the mud and the pine needles, as the helicopter passed overhead. The sound was deafening, the downdraft from the rotors whipping the trees, shaking the rain from the branches. Emeircus could feel the heat of the engine, the prickling sensation of the infrared sweep. He held Jonah's hand, feeling the kid's pulse, steady, controlled, not a trace of fear. The helicopter lingered for a full minute, then it moved on, continuing its circuit to the north. Emeircus waited another 5 minutes, listening to the sound fade into the distance. He risked a look over the log. The cabin was still intact, but he knew it was compromised. They couldn't go back. Time to move, Emeircus said. He helped Jonah to his feet, wiping the mud from his face. We're going to the cave. They moved quickly, sticking to the densest cover, avoiding the open slopes. The rain made the going slow, the mud sucking at their boots, the rock slippery. But they made good time, driven by the knowledge that they were being hunted. They reached the cave just as the light began to fail. Emeircus led Jonah inside, his hand on the kid's shoulder, guiding him through the narrow entrance. He secured the camouflage netting, sealing the entrance from view. He lit a small, shielded lantern, its light relay penetrating the darkness. Jonah immediately began setting up a defensive perimeter. He placed tripwires at the entrance, rigged with empty cans and a few pebbles. He arranged his HEA for quick access, his rifle within reach, his medical kit at his feet. He was preparing for a siege. Emeircus checked the supplies. They had enough food and water for a week, maybe 10 days if they rationed. They had ammo, medical supplies, and a few extra magazines for the rifle. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold out. He sat down next to Jonah, his back against the cold stone wall. He pulled out the radio he'd kept hidden in his pack. He powered it on, the screen glowing green in the darkness. He scanned the frequencies, listening for any chatter, any sign of the CRCH effort. He found it on a local sheriff's frequency. The signal was weak, but he could make out the voices. Unit 2, check the North Ridge. Unit 3, sweep the logging road. Subject is a remed and dangerous. Repeat, a remed and dangerous. Emeircus looked at Jonah. The kid was already listening, his head tilted, his lips moving as he translated the coded language of law enforcement. Witnesses report a single adult male, Caucasian, military background, possibly accompanied by a juvenile male, blind. Extreme caution advised. They knew about Jonah. They knew he was blind. They were using it as a vulnerability, a way to predict their movement. They thought a blind kid would slow Emeircus down, make him predictable. They were wrong. Vance Foundation offering a $2 million RD for information leading to the recovery of the child. No contact. Repeat, no contact. Apprehend on site. $2 million RS. Richer Road was pulling out all the stops. He'd turned the entire region into a hunting ground. He'd made it personal that Emeircus switched off the radio. He looked at Jonah, his face illuminated by the lantern. The kid's expression was unreadable. He wasn't SCA red. He was calculating. They're going to use dogs, Jonas said. Bloodhounds. They'll track our scent from the cabin. It's raining, so the scent will be diluted, but it'll still be there. They'll hit the trail within the hour. Marcus nodded. He'd already considered that. We need to mask the scent. Water, Jonas said. The river. We follow it upstream. The current will wash away our scent, and the cold will numb our skin, reduce the thermal signature. It was a good plan. Risky but good. The river was swollen with runoff, the current was strong, and the water was freezing. But it was their best option. Marcus stood up. He grabbed the packs, redistributing the weight. He handed Jonah his rifle, checking the safety, ensuring the chamber was loaded. He pulled out a pair of waterproof shell suits from the cache and handed one to Jonah. They suited up, sealing themselves against the elements. Marcus checked the entrance one last time, ensuring the tripwires were secure, the camouflage was intact. He didn't expect it to hold for long, but it would buy them time. He led Jonah out of the cave, moving downstream, away from the river. They walked for half a mile, then doubled back, crossing their own tracks, confusing the scent. Then they turned and headed for the river, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. The river was a raging torrent, brown with silt and debris. Marcus waded in, the icy water hitting him like a physical blow. He grabbed Jonah's ARM, pulling him in. The kid gasped as the water hit his chest, but he didn't resist. He just held on, his teeth chattering, his body shivering uncontrollably. They moved upstream, fighting the current, their boots slipping on the slick rocks. The water was waist-deep, the force of the river threatening to knock them off their feet. Marcus kept a firm grip on Jonah, his own body acting as a brace against the current. That they moved like that for an hour, the darkness closing in around them, the sound of the river drowning out everything else. They were cold, exhausted, and terrified, but they kept moving. They had no choice. Finally, Marcus spotted what he was looking for, a small tributary, a narrow creek that fed into the main river. He pulled Jonah into the creek, the water shallower here, the current slower. He followed the creek upstream, moving away from the main river, away from the scent, away from the hunters. They reached a small waterfall, a 10-foot drop into a deep pool. Marcus helped Jonah climb the slippery rocks, his hands numb, his muscles burning. They reached the top of the falls, collapsing onto a flat rock, their bodies shaking with cold and exhaustion. Marcus pulled out a small stove and a pot. He pumped some water from the pool, filtering it through a cloth, then boiling it. He made a strong, bitter tea, forcing Jonah to drink it. The heat began to seep back into their bones, their shivering subsiding. They sat there in the darkness, listening to the sound of the waterfall, the rain, and the distant thunder. They were safe for now, but they both knew it was only a matter of time. Marcus looked at Jonah, his face pale in the moonlight. The kid was awake, his head tilted, his ears straining. He was listening for the dogs, for the helicopters, for the sound of their doom. Marcus reached out and touched the compass under Jonah's shirt. It was cold, but it was there. A reminder. A promise that they were in the fight of their lives. And they were losing. But they weren't beaten. Not yet. The creek bed was a graveyard of silence. For 2 days, they moved only at night, navigating by the faint star light that pierced the thinning clouds and the relentless sound of rushing water. Marcus kept them in the shallows where the current was strongest, the icy grip of the water a constant torment that numbed their legs and muffled their scent. Jonah's lips were blue, his teeth chattering in a rhythm that Marcus found himself counting, a macabre metronome of their survival. They ate cold rations, drank straight from the filtered stream, and slept in fits on beds of wet pine needles, their bodies huddled together for what little warmth they could share. On the third night, the rain finally stopped. The clouds broke, revealing a sky full of indifferent stars. The drop in temperature was immediate and brutal, the mud around them hardening into a brittle crust. Marcus knew this was a double-edged sword. The cold would slow the degradation of their scent, but it would also make their thermal signatures sharper against the environment. And the frost would hold their footprints. A clear our trail for any tracker worth his salt. Jonah stopped abruptly, his hand tightening on Marcus's arm. They're close, he whispered, his voice raspy from the cold. 3 o'clock. 200 meters. Dogs. Bloodhounds. And men. At least 4. Their boots different. One set is heavier. Tactical. Not local PD. Marcus froze, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle. He strained his EARS, but all he could hear was the wind and the creak. Jonah's senses were sharper. He trusted them implicitly. He scanned the tree line to their right, his eyes adjusting to the monochrome landscape. He saw nothing, but he felt it. A presence, a disturbance in the natural order of the forest. Thermal scopes. Marcus murmured, "Negative." Jonah whispered back, "The wind is in our face. They're working upwind. They're using the dogs to lead, not electronics. They're being cautious. They don't know exactly where we are. Marcus made a decision. They couldn't stay here. The creek bed was a funnel. He pulled Jonah into the cover of a dense thicket of rhododendron, the waxy leaves providing some concealment from infrared. He unslung his rifle, flipping the safety off with a soft click. He checked the magazine, ensuring it was topped off. He pulled out a suppressor from his pack and screwed it onto the BA rail. The added length would affect the balance, but the silence was worth it. Jonah was already moving. He crawled deeper into the thicket, his body low to the ground, his movements fluid and silent. He found a depression behind a large root and settled in, his rifle braced against his shoulder, his finger outside the trigger guarrot. He was in a firing position, his head tilted, his EARS locked onto the approaching threat. Marcus joined him, taking up a position that covered the flank. He could hear them now, the faint jingle of hayar, the soft murmur of voices, the unmistakable baying of the hounds, their excitement growing as they hit the fresher scent or the creek. "They're splitting up," Jonah whispered. 2 men and a dog, a circling wide to the left. The other 2, a coming straight up the creek. The tactical one is with them. He sees ryeing an MP5. Subsonic ammo. Suppressed. He's expecting a fight. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. These weren't rent-a-cops. They were professionals. Ex-military, most likely. Richer Road had hired a private kill team. They weren't there to apprehend. They were there to eliminate. The baying of the dogs grew louder, closer. Marcus could hear the splashing of boots in the shallow water. He could smell them now. The wet dog, the gun oil, the stale sweat of men who hadn't slept in days. A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the thicket. Not a flashlight. Too focused. An IR illuminator. They were using night vision. "They're scanning," Jonas said, his voice barely audible. "They know we're close. They just don't know exactly where." Marcus held his breath. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a heavy, rhythmic thud that seemed loud in the silence. He forced himself to relax, to control his breathing, to slow his heart rate. He focused on the front sight post of his rifle, his world narrowing to the patch of darkness where the enemy would AR. The light swept past them, lingering for a second on the thicket, then moving on. The men were 10 meters away now. Marcus could hear their breathing, the soft thud of their boots on the frozen mud. One of the dogs let out a RPBARK, a signal that it had found the scent. The men stopped. Marcus heard the distinctive sound of a weapon being shouldered, the soft rustle of nylon. "Contact." Jonah whispered. Marcus didn't wait. He squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle made a soft fut sound. The man in the lead, the one with the MP5, dropped without a sound, a neat whole ring in his forehead. Marcus shifted his aim, firing 3 more shots in rapid succession. 2 more men fell. The 4th, the handler, dove for cover behind a fallen log, dragging the dog with him. The forest erupted in a cacophony of sound. The king of the dog, the shouting of the handler, the suppressed coughs of the MP5 returning fire. Bullets ripped through the thicket, shredding the leaves, splintering the branches, kicking up frozen dirt. Marcus stayed low, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. He wasn't trying to kill. He was trying to suppress, to keep the handler pinned down. He saw Jonah move. The kid crawled out of his depression, his rifle tucked tight, his movements impossibly fluid. He was moving toward the handler's flank, using the chaos of the firefight as cover. Marcus shifted his fire, laying down a base of suppressive fire, forcing the handler to keep his head down. He saw Jonah reach a position 10 feet from the log. The kid paused, his head tilted, listening to the handler's breathing, to the dog's whimpering. Then Jonah moved. He stood up in one fluid motion, his rifle coming up. He fired once. The sound was different, sharper, louder. He was using his own unsuppressed rifle. The shot was perfectly placed. The handler's head snapped back, and he went silent. The dog let out a yelp and bolted into the woods. The silence descended once more, broken only by the ringing in M.A. Ruckus's ERS and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He stayed in his position for a full minute, scanning the darkness, ensuring there were no more threats. Then he moved. He crawled over to Jonah, who was already checking the bodies. The kid was efficient, methodical. He took the magazines from the dead men's vests, their radios, their NVGs. He moved with a cold professionalism that chilled M.A. Ruckus to the bone. 2 dead, 2 wounded, Jonah reported, his voice flat. The one I shot is gone. The others are bleeding out. No survivors. M.A. Ruckus looked at the Ceo When H. 4 men, highly trained, well-equipped, dead or dying in a matter of seconds. And it was Jonah who had taken out the most dangerous one, the tactical operator. The kid had moved like a ghost, struck like a viper, and Disape read back into the shadows. You did good, M.A. Ruckus said. His voice hoa R8. Jonah didn't respond. He was already stripping the bodies of anything useful. He took the tactical vest from the leader, checking the trauma plates, the mag pouches. He found a satellite phone and a GPS unit. He handed them to M.A. Ruckus. M.A. Ruckus looked at the kid. His face was splattered with blood and mud. His eyes were cold and hard. His breathing was steady. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a killer, a survivor, a product of the brutal education M.A. Ruckus had given him. We need to move, Jonah said. The shot was loud. They'll have it. Reinforcements will be here in minutes. We need to cache the bodies, take their AR and Disape AR. M.A. Ruckus nodded. He helped Jonah drag the bodies into a shallow ravine, covering them with branches and snow. They took everything of value: weapons, ammo, comms, medical supplies. They left nothing behind but the blood and the silence. They moved out, heading deeper into the wilderness, away from the creek, away from the Ceo When H. They moved fast, driven by adrenaline and the knowledge that they were now in a fight for their lives. Richer Road had escalated. The rules of engagement had changed. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a war or dot. As they crested a ridge, M.A. Ruckus looked back. The forest was dark, silent, and deadly. Somewhere out there, a helicopter was already lifting off, carrying news of the failure back to Richer Road Vance. And somewhere out there, another team was already being dispatched. M.A. Ruckus looked at Jonah, walking beside him, his face set in stone, his hand resting on the compass. The kid was ready. He'd passed the ultimate test. He'd taken a life to save a life. He'd become what his father had been. M.A. Ruckus felt a surge of pride and a profound sense of loss. He'd created a monster. Or perhaps he'd forged a weapon. Either way, there was no going back. The hunt was on. And they were the prey. But they were a remed. And they were dangerous. They moved for 3 days without rest, pushing deeper into the rugged wilderness of the Selkirk Mountains. The firefight had changed everything. The satellite phone M.A. Ruckus had taken from the dead operative confirmed it. Richer Road Vance had mobilized a private security firm with Melita re-contracts, and they were operating under a dead or alive directive. The thermal scans were constant now, the whump-whump of helicopters a recurring tremor in the air. M.A. Ruckus and Jonah abandoned the high ground, moving into the dense, old-growth forest where the canopy masked their heat signatures and the thick underbrush muffled their passage. Jonah's senses were their only EARLY warning system. He could detect the faint hum of a drone's electric motor a mile away, the metallic tang of a thermal drone's battery ling in the air. He'd Leah Rened to identify the specific sound of a Heckler & Koch MP7 versus an M4, the subtle difference in the report of subsonic versus supersonic ammunition. He was no longer just a blind boy. He was a biological sensor array, his brain processing data that no electronic device could match. On the 4th night, they reached a derelict logging camp, a collection of rusted machinery and collapsing shacks swallowed by decades of growth. M.A. Ruckus decided to hole up here temporarily, to treat a deepening gash on Jonah's calf from a fall on black ice, and to finally get some uninterrupted sleep. He'd just finished stitching the wound with sterile suture thread and a curved needle. Jonah's jaw clamped tight, but not a sound escaping him, when the kid's head snapped up. Vehicle, Jonah whispered. Diesel. Heavy duty. Not a Humvee. A Dodge Ram 3500. Modified. Lifted. Off-road tires. It's coming up the old logging road. 2 miles out. Slow. Deliberate. Not sea urchin. Arriving. Americus felt a cold, dread coil in his stomach. No one came up this road by accident. He grabbed his rifle, checking the optic. He moved to the edge of the shack, peering through a gap in the rotting wood. He saw the faint glow of headlights cutting through the trees, bouncing with the rough terrain. The truck was coming directly for the camp. 1 occupant, Jonah added. His EA are pressed to the floorboy RDS male. Heavy. Boots. Hey LR. He's not alone. There's a second he beat in the truck. Faint. Illegal AR. A hostage. Or a prisoner. Americus's blood ran cold. A hostage Richa Road was bringing in civilians, now using them as bait. He watched as the truck rumbled into the clear ring, its high beams illuminating the derelict machinery. The engine died. The doors opened. A man stepped out, his silhouette massive against the lights. He was wearing tactical HAR, a ballistic vest, and a helmet with NVG mounts. He moved with the confidence of a man who owned the night. Then the passenger door opened. A woman was pushed out. She stumbled, catching herself before she fell. Even from a distance, Americus recognized her. Catherine, Jonah's mother. Richa RD's wife. She was disheveled, her clothes torn, her face streaked with dirt and TRS. But she was alive. The tactical operator grabbed her ARM, dragging her Tawa RD the shack. Mitchell, he shouted, his voice amplified by the empty space. I know you're in there. Come out, or the wife gets a bullet in the knee. And then the other knee. And then we'll see how much the kid likes listening to her scream. Americus looked at Jonah. The kid was perfectly still, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't look SCA red. He looked ready to kill. Americus put a hand on his shoulder, a silent command to hold. He had to assess the situation. The operator was using Catherine as a shield, his body positioned behind hers. He was a professional. He wouldn't make a mistake. But he was also arrogant. He thought Americus was just a single dad with a rifle. He didn't know about Jonah. Mitchell, the operator yelled again. Don't make me ask twice. You've got 10 seconds. 10-9. Americus made his decision. He couldn't let Catherine be executed. He couldn't let Richa Road win. He stood up slowly, keeping his rifle low, his hands visible. He stepped out of the shadows, into the GLA ray of the headlights. I'm here, Americus said, his voice echoing in the clear ring. Let her go. The operator laughed, a RSH, grating sound. Well, the legend himself. Drop the rifle, Mitchell. Slowly. Or ISTART with her kneecaps. Americus knelt down, placing his rifle on the ground. He stood back up, his hands raised. I'm gonna med. Let her go. The operator shoved Catherine to her knees. He kept his pistol trained on her head, his eyes locked on Americus. You've caused a lot of trouble, Mitchell. Mr. Vance is very unhappy. He wants the kid, and he wants you dead. But I'm a professional. I'll take you both alive. For a price. What price? Americus asked, stalling, his mind racing. He needed to create an opening. He needed to get the operator's attention away from Catherine. Information, the operator said. The location of the rest of your team. The safe houses. The caches. You give me that, and I'll make it quick. For both of you. Americus saw movement from the corner of his eye. Jonah was moving. The kid was crawling out of the back of the shack, using the shadows and the rusted machinery for cover. He was moving with inhuman silence, his body low, his rifle tucked tight. He was circling around, heading for the operator's blind side. I don't have a team, Americus said, keeping his voice steady, drawing the operator's attention. It's just me and the kid. We're just trying to survive. Bullshit, the operator sneered. You're a SEAL. You don't operate solo. You're a ghost. But I've got your ghost now. And I've got your leverage. He pressed the pistol rider against Catherine's temple. She whimpered, her eyes squeezed shut. Americus saw the fear in her face, the desperation. But he also saw something else. A flicker of recognition. She was looking at him, not with fear but with a strange, desperate hope. Jonah, she whispered. Is he okay? The operator's grip tightened. Shut up, Bitch. But it was enough. The distraction was enough. Jonah was in position. Marcus saw the kid's silhouette against the faint light from the truck's dashboard road. He was 20 feet away, his rifle raised, his aim steady. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dropped to the ground, rolling to his right, away from the line of fire. At the same moment, Jonah fired. The shot was a shot RP crack in the silence. Not suppressed. The operator's head snapped back, a spray of blood and bone erupting from his skull. He dropped like a stone, his pistol clattering to the ground. Catherine screamed, scrambling away from the bodied. Marcus was already moving. He lunged for his rifle, ping it up, his eyes scanning the tree line for more threats. But there were none. The operator was alone. A lone wolf, sent to deliver a message, or perhaps to tie up a loose end. Marcus rushed to Catherine, pulling her to her feet. She was shaking, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "Jonah," she gasped. "Where's Jonah?" Jonah emerged from the shadows, his rifle still raised, his face cold and impassive. He walked over to the body, nudging it with his boot, ensuring it was dead. Then he looked at his mother. "I'm here, Mom," he said, his voice flat. "I'm okay." Catherine Sta read at him, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at the blood on his face, the rifle in his hands, the coldness in his eyes. This wasn't the boy she'd protected, the boy she'd kept in a gilded cage. This was a stranger, a warrior. What have you done to him?" she whispered, looking at Marcus. Marcus met her gaze. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She could see the answer in Jonah's eyes. She could see the transformation. She'd wanted to protect her son from the truth, from the violence, from the legacy of his father. But in doing so, she'd made him a victim. Marcus had made him a survivor. Jonah walked over to her, his movement stiff. He reached out, his hand finding her ARM. He squeezed it, a gesture of reassurance, but there was no warmth in it. "It's okay, Mom," he said. "We're safe now." But they weren't safe. Not even close. The operator's death would be reported. Richard Road would know they were in the Selkirks. He'd send more men, more helicopters, more drones. They had to move. Now. Marcus grabbed Catherine's ARM, pulling her Tawa RD the truck. "Get in," he commanded. "Both of you." Jonah didn't argue. He helped his mother into the passenger seat, then climbed into the back, his rifle across his lap. Marcus got behind the wheel, Sta rooting the engine. He threw the truck into reverse, spinning the wheels, kicking up mud and gravel. He floored it, accelerating down the logging road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Catherine was crying, her body shaking with sobs. Jonah sat silently in the back, his hand on the compass, his face turned Tawa RD the wind. He was listening to the engine, to the tires, to the forest rushing past. He was calculating their escape route, anticipating the pursuit. Marcus drove like a man possessed, his eyes rooting to the REA review mirror, the side mirrors, the RK trees flashing by. He knew they were in a race against time. Richard Road would be expecting a call from his operative. When it didn't come, he'd unleash hell. And Marcus intended to be long gone before that happened. He looked at Jonah in the REA review mirror. The kid's eyes met his. There was no fear there, no regret, only a cold, hot RD resolve. The boy was gone. The soldier had taken his place. Marcus looked back at the road. The truck bounced and swayed, the suspension groaning. He pushed it rider, faster, the needle climbing past 80, past 90. They were flying through the night, a stolen truck, a rescued mother, and a transformed son. They were heading for the border. For Canada. For freedom. But the road ahead was the RK, and the hunters were close behind. Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel. He looked at the compass on the dashboard ARD, its needles swinging wildly with the movement of the truck. It didn't matter. He knew the direction. North. Always north. Toa RD the truth. Tower Road the reckoning. Tower Road the end of the the Dodge Ram's fuel gauge hit empty 12 miles from the Canadian border. Marcus coasted it into a dry creek bed, the heavy chassis settling into the mud with a wee regroan. He killed the lights, the engine, and the lingering hum of the heater. The sudden silence was a physical weight, broken only by Catherine's ragged breathing and the distant, rhythmic thump of a helicopter. Not the Black Hawk from before, but the heavier, slower beat of a civilian news chopper, drawn by the electromagnetic pulse of a manhunt. that had consumed the northwest. Jonah was already moving. He slid out of the back seat, his rifle slung tight, his boots hitting the frozen EARTH with a dull thud. He didn't wait for MA or cuss. He moved Tawa RD the tree line, his head tilted, his nostrils FLA ring. He was tracking the wind, the scent of jet fuel, and the faint, metallic tang of the border fence 3 miles to the north. MA or cuss turned to Catherine. She was shivering, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the cold. "He's not a boy anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What did you do to him?" "I taught him to survive," Emericus said, his voice flat. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the satellite phone he'd stripped from the dead operative. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. He powered it on, the screen flickering to life. He scrolled through the contacts until he found the one he needed, a number he hadn't dialed in 5 years. A number that belonged to a man who owed him a life debt. A man who owned a private airstrip in British Columbia that he dialed. It rang 4 times before a gruff, familiar, voice answered. "Yeah. It's Mitchell," Emericus said. "I need a pickup. CO Redinates 48.9983 degrees north, 117.0382 degrees west. 3 passengers. 1 is a civilian female. The other is my priority. We have a 2-hour window before the Border Patrol locks this sector down." There was a long pause. "You sure about this, Mitch? The heat on this is biblical. Vance has the governor, the feds, everyone in his pocket." "I'm sure," Emericus said. "The kid is with me. Chris's kid." Another pause. Longer this time. Emericus could hear the man breathing, weighing the risk, the loyalty, the cost. "All right. 2 hours. But you haul ass. My bird lifts at 0500, Riga ruthless. If you're not there, I leave you." "Copy," Emericus said. He hung up. He looked at Catherine. "We walk from here. 3 miles. Uphill. Can you do it?" Catherine looked at him, then looked past him to where Jonah was waiting, a dark silhouette against the trees. She saw the rifle in his hands, the compass around his neck, the cold certainty in his posture. She saw the man her son had become, and she saw the woman she'd failed to be. "I can do it," she said, her voice stronger now. She climbed out of the truck, her legs trembling but her resolve hardening. "Lead the way." Emericus nodded. He grabbed the go-bags, handing one to Catherine, slinging the other over his shoulder. He took point, moving fast, his rifle at the low ready. Jonah took the REAR, his presence a silent, vigilant shadow. Catherine was in the middle, her breathing labored, her steps unsteady, but she kept pace. They moved through the forest like ghosts, their passage silent, their movements so redinated. Emericus navigated by the stars, by the feel of the ground, by the whisper of the wind. Jonah navigated by the sound of the border fence, by the vibration of the patrol vehicles on the access road, by the scent of the Fraser River just beyond the ridge. They reached the airstrip with 20 minutes to Spa-Re. It was a single, unlit strip of asphalt red into a clear ring, surrounded by dense forest. A twin-engine turboprop was already warming up, its props spinning, its lights cutting through the darkness. A man stood by the open cargo door, smoking a cigarette, his face obscured by the glow. Emericus led them across the tarmac. The man looked up as they approached. He was older, his face weathered, his eyes harrowed. He looked at Emericus, then at Jonah, then at Catherine. He took a long drag of his cigarette, then flicked it into the darkness. "That him?" the man asked, nodding. Tawa RD Jonah. "Yeah," Emericus said. "That's him." The man looked at Jonah for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Get in. All of you. We're burning daylight." They climbed ABOA Road. The interior was Spartan, metal benches, cargo nets, the smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid. Emericus secured the door, then moved to the cockpit, speaking in low tones with the pilot. Jonah sat on a bench, his rifle across his knees, his hand resting on the compass. Catherine sat opposite him, watching him, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The engines ROA red, the plane accelerating down the runway, lifting off into the pre-dawn sky. As they climbed, the lights of the manhunt below grew smaller, fainter, until they were swallowed by the darkness. The border, the fences, the helicopters, the hunters, They were all behind them now. Jonah didn't look back. He kept his face turned Tawa RD the front, Tawa RD the rising sun, Tawa RD the new horizon. He could feel the plane's vibration, the change in air pressure, the shift in the wind. He was mapping their trajectory, calculating their speed, estimating their arrival time. Americus joined them, taking a seat next to Jonah. He looked at the kid, at the compass in his hand, at the cold, hard resolve in his eyes. He reached out, placing a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "It's over," he said. Jonah didn't respond. He just turned the compass over in his hand, his thumb tracing the engraving on the back. "For Jonah, stay sharp." He looked at the cracked glass, the missing needle. He looked at the sunrise, a brilliant, blinding orb of gold on the horizon. "It's not over," Jonah said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's just beginning." Americus understood. The physical escape was complete, but the psychological war was just sta rooting. Jonah had lost his childhood in the crucible of the mountains. He'd gained a lethal skill set, a cold CLA righty, and a profound understanding of the world's brutality. He wasn't going back to a normal life. He couldn't. He was a product of the shadows now, a creature of the hunt. But Catherine reached out, her hand trembling, and touched Jonah's arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Jonah didn't pull away. He just looked at her, his sightless eyes seeming to see right through her. "You were afraid," he said. "You wanted to protect me. But you protected me from the truth. And the truth is a weapon. You disarmed me." Catherine bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I was wrong." Jonah turned back to the window, watching the sun climb higher. "But I have the weapon now, and I know how to use it." Americus looked at Catherine, then at Jonah. He saw the chasm between them, the gulf of experience, of trauma, of transformation. He saw the mother's guilt and the son's cold acceptance. He saw the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He looked at the compass in Jonah's hand. The needle was gone, but the direction was clear, north. Tower rode a new life. Tower rode a new purpose. Tower rode a new war. The plane continued to climb, leaving the darkness behind, heading into the light. Americus leaned back against the bulkhead, closing his eyes. He was tired, exhausted, but he was at peace. He'd kept his promise. He'd delivered the kid. He'd honored his friend's memory. And he'd forged a bond that no manhunt, no billionaire, no Ramey could break. Jonah sat silently, his hand on the compass, his face turned Tawa RD the sun. He was no longer a blind boy in a gilded cage. He was a seer, a hunter, a survivor. He was his father's son. And he was just getting sta route. The plane banked, turning Tawa RD the west, Tawa RD the ocean, Tawa RD the unknown. Below them, the world was waking up, on a re of the war that had just ended, and the new one that had just begun. Americus opened his eyes, looking at Jonah. The kid was still watching the sun, his face illuminated by its golden light. Americus nodded to himself. He'd done his job. He'd taught the kid how to see it. Now it was up to Jonah to decide what to look at. And Americus had a feeling he already knew the answer. The compass had found its true north. And it was pointing directly at the future.